Well, how to spend it if we had it. So you've heard some ideas on let's spend it on increasing productivity in agriculture from our tour. We had a whole session on technological opportunities. We had an excellent session on how to use the money to lever much larger investments of using private sector capital. And we just had a tour de force on investing it in forestry. This panel, I think, is to deal with a subset of the responsible authorities. In my experience, all ministries and governments are equal, but there was one in each government that is more equal. The finance ministry or the treasury. And I think this particular panel is going to deal with three of the sets of instruments that finance ministries or treasuries rule over, which involve the spending, potential spending of money. We're going to hear from Eli on what could be done if we were to have revenue neutral carbon taxes. How would the money be spent in terms of other tax expenditures? We're going to hear from Shuiman on regulatory systems, cap and trade systems. And then Ian's going to talk to us a little bit about, I understand, about inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and of course what would be done with the proceeds if we were to get rid of them. So if I could introduce Eli, president of the R Street Institute. He was a vice president previous to that of the Heartland Institute. He's been involved in a coalition of taxpayer environmental insurance and free market groups called SmarterSafer.org, which worked on risk-based insurance rates, mitigation, and environmental protection. He also has been an insider working for the Senate Majority Leader, and any problems you have with things that Bill Frist said, you can blame Eli. He's worked at Unisys. He was a senior editor of the American Enterprise magazine and a fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Eli.
Here we go. Thank you so much for that introduction. As a right-wing Republican speaking here at the SEIU headquarters, it's just a dream come true for me. I mean, look, I'm a pretty typical pro-life, pro-gun Republican. My topic today is a carbon tax, also like right-to-work laws. My topic today is a carbon tax and mitigation. But before I get to that, I want to explain a little bit about what I think about climate change and how we should deal with it. So let me start. Climate change is real, human-caused to a very significant extent, and likely to be a problem in the future. And furthermore, I know how to solve it. I really do. I know how to solve climate change. And I have a plan that I'm sure will work. Let me number off the points in my plan. Point number 1. Be really rich in the future. Point number 2. Actually, there is no number 2. That's it. I'm serious about this. The nature of climate change and the unknowns it involves means that the best way to be prepared for it is to have lots of resources to deal with it. Climate change is a wicked problem. That is to say, it is a problem, to quote the management thinker and philosopher Seward Churchman, that is characterized by incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize at the time. That's so in the developed world, and equally so, perhaps more so, in the less developed world. Today, I'm going to review my thoughts about proposals to deal with climate change, explain to you how I think a carbon tax could best be structured to deal with climate change, and how structuring it the way that I think is best will do the best job for the developed world and the developing world alike. Let me explain my view first on existing proposals to deal with carbon pollution and CO2. I loathe them. I really loathe them. I strongly oppose the Waxman-Markey bill and nearly every other proposal that has emanated from the political left to deal with climate change. My reasons for disliking them are pretty simple. They happen to consist of very long lists of things: higher taxes, subsidies for favored industries, punishments for disfavored ones, that people on the political left wanted anyway. That said, there's nothing wrong with using a major public policy issue, particularly one with uncertain results somewhat far in the future, to do things you want to do anyway. Actually, that's exactly what I want to do. Exactly what I want to do. I have a list of things that I want to do anyway, and a revenue-neutral carbon tax is a good way to accomplish them. My list includes lower taxes, less government intrusion in people's private lives, and more freedom in general. In other words, stuff I want anyway. And that's a perfectly appropriate approach to deal with a problem like this. To deal with any problem like this, one must start with a conception of the good and figure out a way to get there. All liberal democracies struggle with a trade-off between liberty and equality. I tend to prioritize liberty, and so do a lot on the left, like John Rawls. And as such, I like a carbon tax on that basis alone. Let me outline the ways I think it could best be structured. First, it should be used to increase the efficiency of our tax code overall, and reduce the deadweight losses implicit in the current tax system. Our current tax code has dozens of features that almost no economist, left, right, or center.
Is that your presentation?
No. Yeah.
Apologize. Don't touch it. It'll be okay.
Yes.
I apologize.
My apologies for my klutziness in touching the keyboard, actually. So our current tax system has dozens of features that no economist, left, right, or center, would actually include if designing a tax system from scratch. Most, if not all, tariffs, the current levels of payroll taxes, the tax on labor, on work, in other words, and high marginal corporate tax rates with lots of loopholes. Almost nobody, of course, has an optimal tax system. On balance, though, taxing things you want less of, like pollution, is a much better way to fund the government than taxing things you want more of, like wages, income, and profits. And currently, we spend a lot of time and energy taxing things that in the abstract we would say are good. Second, a carbon tax should be revenue neutral, or at least very close to it. Making energy more costly, exactly what a carbon tax will do, is going to have some negative economic consequences for sure. The best way to mitigate these is to mitigate them by cutting other taxes. Ideally, eliminate them outright in a way that distributes the burden in a fair and equitable way. I'd look in particular at payroll taxes and corporate income taxes, which have a tax incidence to wages that's quite high, actually, as two things that we might look to replace or at least reduce significantly using a carbon tax. Third, a carbon tax should be a way to eliminate other regulations outright and make the economy overall more efficient. If we get the price of carbon right, no easy problem, but one that I believe is soluble, a large number of regulations we impose on the economy. Regulations, CAFE, the new power plant rules, that in effect amount to a shadow but unknown price on carbon, could be eliminated and should be eliminated. A real transparent price will do much better. The entire idea of spending it, is a little bit silly. There shouldn't be anything to spend. The money should go back to those who earned it. And I would also say that in the long term, this is probably the best strategy for the less developed world, too. ODA and whatever else you look at is largely a function of overall GDP. If we can grow our own economy, if we can become wealthier and work to make the rest of the world wealthier, then we can and should and will be able to increase the amount of assistance we give to other countries. I wouldn't say that it's the single most important problem we should be dealing with. It probably isn't. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't spend any money on reducing carbon emissions in the less developed world. It has some advantages relative to other areas of regulation. but I don't think it should be the first priority for ODA, and maybe not even the second. Let me close with this. I don't like proposals from the left to deal with climate change, and I have no plans, really, to spend the money that's earned. I think the best way to deal with climate change is to become wealthier in the future. I want to give the money back to people who earn it. And I think it's fair to say that this is the best strategy for the developing world. At minimum, it's the surest. The nature of the carbon tax fits in well with my conceptions of what is good and what is right. After all, isn't advancing one's own vision of what's good and what's right the very point of politics? Thanks so much.
You know, sitting up here, you get a different perspective than when you're in the audience. Up here, you get a view of the body language out there. And Eli, you had the full spectrum. There are some big smiles, and there are some really tight-lipped frowns. I'm wondering, before we go on to the next speaker, is there anybody on either extreme? I mean, the biggest smile, I think, was yours over there. Is there anybody who wants to direct a particular song of praise in Eli's direction, or a barbed criticism? Is there a reaction?
Here's Bill Frist. Come and talk to our Republicans in the House, especially, please.
We're trying.
Okay, let's move on to our second member on the panel, Shuiman Wang, team leader for the World Bank's Partnership for Market Readiness. Despite her apparent youth, she's been around. She's been a member of I should say she's one of the authors of the 2010 World Development Report on Development and Climate Change. But previously, she's been with the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal. She's worked at the UNFCCC Secretariat in Bonn, and she's been a member of the Department of the Law Department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. And she's also involved with the World Economics Forum's Climate Change Council for their global agenda. So please.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction. Ellie, I wish the world just black and white, that's straightforward. Perhaps also share with you, what other countries are doing, and perhaps also interesting to see what China and other emerging economies are doing and pursuing climate agenda. And I also want to use some of the examples to share my observation that how to use public financing to leverage potentially policy transformation. We have heard a lot about using public funding, $1 leverage, a number of dollars of private fund investment. But sometimes, in fact, a small amount of funding, public funding, can make a change transformationally in a country. Not really about money. Money is important, but that's not all about money. In particular, when we are engaging with middle-income countries. Perhaps also let you know that where I come from, the views and why it's like that. I'm managing this global partnership program, Partnership for Market Readiness, which includes about 30 major economies representing altogether almost 80% of global emissions. Countries like US, China, India, South Africa, Brazil, all part of these partnership programs. It's becoming, it started with really carbon market instruments, but it's really becoming a broader platform for mitigation. And what we see is really very much encouraging what's happening on the ground. And just to give you perhaps just a few examples that how countries are using carbon pricing instruments to pursue mitigation agenda. That's just two examples. One is South Africa. South Africa National Treasury has launched this carbon tax. The current is going through a public consultation. The idea is that by 2015, a nationwide carbon tax scheme would be set up, and going forward, the tax threshold would also go up. But even at the very beginning, currently, if you use the current exchange rate with US dollar, we are talking about 14 US dollars per ton. And they're also looking at the different elements and how to make this carbon tax innovative in the way that you also factor in the market elements. For example, that within this carbon tax scheme, they are considering design so-called offset scheme, allowing companies, covered companies, to use offset programs perhaps within South Africa at the very beginning, to offset their tax liability. And there have been a lot of resistance, naturally, just about why South Africa would pursue carbon tax, and a lot of concerns about competitiveness, then why South Africa would do it, while other country like US is not doing it. Also, the industry has serious concerns about distribution impact, about their competitiveness. That's why they are looking at doing a lot of modeling exercise to understand the implications, how to design the instrument in the way that will address potential job losses, restructuring economy, and competitiveness. It's very interesting, and PMI is helping South Africa National Treasury doing a lot of modeling exercise. But overall, that they do see a carbon constraint world is coming. So South Africa wants to position itself as one of the leading countries among the emerging economies to price carbon. So that's on South Africa. And they have, you probably ask why South Africa is doing carbon tax, because they have done their own studies and concluded that if you look at the number of emitters, it does not make sense for them to go for emissions trading scheme. They are talking about probably just very, very few major emitters. If they do trading, they would just trade among themselves. And as a result, carbon tax makes much more sense. But this may not be the case for China. That is, carbon tax is still ongoing debate. But let me just say, China probably, many of you probably aware that they have launched the emissions trading pilots in 7 provinces and cities. Even we're just talking about the number 7, but we are talking about 200 million people would be covered under even just a piloting scheme, and talking about 1/3 of GDP would be also covered. And many entities will be part of this piloting scheme. And it's very interesting also to see that why China would do it. And it's a great opportunity from Chinese perspective that this is time, and also to consider the pricing carbon. First, I think that, of course, also it's linked to a much bigger picture. I would say climate change agenda is not the only way that drives this move forward. It's much big picture. The first is the whole consideration of restructuring economy. They have to shift from resources-based growth to a very different modality of growth. That's very important. And secondly, as a whole, linking to that pollution, and they have made a decision that they do want to control the overall coal consumption. The government is going to start with voluntary, but very soon potentially mandatory, the absolute energy consumption, in particular on coal. So that provides an important basis for them to regulate carbon. And also, I think you mentioned about Copenhagen. How, as a Chinese, also part of the delegation many years ago, and I personally have seen this transformational change in China about climate policy. Back in my time, I probably look younger, but many years ago, I was part of delegation. At that time, I always remember. I have 1 minute, so we were even not allowed to talk about mitigation. Mitigation belongs to the world of developed countries. And today, I think the whole country wholeheartedly embrace low carbon. As a result, there's a national no carbon day in June, and they have launched a number of pricing instruments. So I was in China last week. It's very exciting to see that so many things are happening at the provisional level, and massive work has been done in collecting data, doing MRV work, and also very lively debate on carbon tax. Carbon tax, just which instrument will be better, it's going on. But I think there's a collective sense. Carbon constraint world is going to be here to stay, and how China positions itself to move early and to find a suitable instrument. And of course, people also well, it depends on how you think about U.S. and China. But overall, I think also there's also realization, at least for those who favor carbon market instruments, for China to really to do this massive mitigation, and you need to mobilize private sector. And what will be the incentives for private sector to participate, in this mitigation action? If you do carbon taxes, it will be part of the resource tax. Industry will not really feel this. It's just another way for government to collect the tax. So if you take this out as a carbon market, emissions trading, and you will see, no matter how high the price will be, when you transfer this liability into carbon asset for companies to manage, and becomes incentive. And they learn from the U.S. and now they are, and at least a part of the government, is moving this forward very quickly. I actually want to share with you just a few words on the observation, how we engage in middle-income countries, the public funding. I do think that number of lessons, at least we have seen from working with PMR countries. The number one is that you really need to get the right counterpart, and that's a process that how you integrate all those studies, intervention into really policy decision making. That's number one. And secondly, that how you also tailor the needs of the countries. There are a lot of abstract, work, but it's very important that the countries are very different. How you tailor the need. And okay, maybe I stop here. I have been reminded to stop, so I should stop. If I have opportunity to answer some questions, happy to share information.
Well, thanks very much. Just before we move to Ian, I just want to warn Eli, I'm going to ask him a question later, give us some time to think about it, otherwise it's unfair. We suspend disbelief here, Eli, so I want you to suspend this disbelief. The Republicans win in 2016, and you become the eminence grise at the Treasury Department. So you're in. What's the scale of the carbon tax? What's the phase-in schedule? And are you going to have BTAs? And once we have the scale, you'll get an idea that you're not going to be able, I don't think, at least in the early years, to abolish all income taxes and all corporate taxes. So where would you start? And Shuiman, I'm going to ask you again the same sort of question. In China, you say there's going to be this pilot. What's the intended schedule of increases, and what's going to be done with the money? Is it going to be earmarked and spent on particular environmental considerations, or on what? Anyway, there's a great Japanese classic film called Rashomon, where you get the same story retold from 3 different perspectives. And in Ian Parry, we have an incredible resource, because he can give you the perspective from the IMF, from an NGO, Resources for the Future, from universities in 3 different countries, and most important, from the U.S. government. Ian.
Okay, if I sit, can I use the clicker, or should I start? Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, Ian, you want to sit there but have the clicker?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Hard weekend of gardening. Okay, so obviously fossil fuel subsidies are a major deterrent to climate finance. I mean, for example, they reduce the attractiveness of renewable fuels relative to fossil fuels. So I just want to talk about the definition of fossil fuel subsidies and how large they are, and then how to move forward with subsidy reform, and what might be the role of climate finance in helping to facilitate this. So we can usefully define 2 types of fossil fuel subsidies. Firstly, what we call pre-tax subsidies, and these just occur when the domestic fuel prices are less than the costs of supplying the fuels. And secondly, we can define post-tax subsidies, which equal the pre-tax subsidies plus the implicit subsidy due to the failure to charge for environmental damages in fuel prices. And by environmental damages, I don't just mean CO2, I mean also the air pollution damages, and for motor fuels, the traffic congestion and traffic accidents. So this recent IMF study attempts to measure both of these subsidies. For example, the pre-tax subsidies is estimated using the so-called price gap approach. That's where we look at the difference between the international fuel prices adjusted for transportation and distribution costs and the prices that domestically firms and households are actually paying. And then the post-tax subsidies are then inferred using a very crude first-pass extrapolation of environmental damages from case studies at the global level. Although now we're working on much more refined estimates of environmental damages on a country-by-country level. But it's critical to eliminate the post-tax subsidies, that is to reflect the supply costs and the environmental damages in energy prices in order to stimulate sufficient investment in low-carbon technologies and green technologies more generally. So this picture here shows the magnitude of the subsidies. We've estimated the pre-tax subsidies at about $490 billion worldwide for 2011. 44% of that is petroleum subsidies, 31% is electricity subsidies, 23% is natural gas, but only 1% is coal subsidies. And the regional breakout is that the Middle East and North Africa is responsible for 48% of these subsidies, obviously the major oil-producing countries, whereas the advanced countries are responsible for only 5%. So traditionally, it's been the developing countries, the developed countries, telling the developing countries to phase out these subsidies. But the picture changes radically when we look at post-tax subsidies, when you take into account the implicit subsidies for the failure to charge for environmental damages. First of all, the magnitude of the subsidies quadruples from $490 billion up to $2 trillion. Secondly, coal's now responsible for 36% of these subsidies because we're not charging for the large carbon damages and air pollution damages from coal. In addition, petroleum is still a large contributor to these subsidies, 37%, because most countries aren't fully charging for carbon damages, local pollution, traffic congestion, traffic accidents in their motor fuels. In addition, the regional breakout now looks rather different because it's the advanced countries that contribute the most to these subsidies, 32%. Again, that's just due to the failure to charge for the environmental damages from coal use and adequately charge for vehicle-related externalities. And the share from the Middle East and North Africa drops to 19%. So what would be the impacts of subsidy reform? Well, obviously there'd be a huge fiscal dividend. If we remove the post-tax subsidies, so we reflect both supply costs and environmental damages and fuel prices, we'd raise revenues of about 2.5 percentage points of GDP, or about 8% of total tax revenue, so that's quite a substantial amount. We'd reduce global CO2 emissions by something in the order of about 13-15%. And there'd be very substantial health benefits, because if we properly priced energy, we'd largely eliminate the 3.2 million premature deaths from air pollution. That would require appropriate crediting for the adoption of emissions control technologies at coal plants, but these technologies can cut emissions by 90-95% or even more than that. So moving on to how can we promote subsidy reform, well, I think the first point to emphasize is that holding down energy prices below levels that are warranted on the grounds of supply costs and environmental damages is really quite a terrible distributional policy, because the vast majority of the benefits leak away to higher income groups. This is not a well-targeted policy. So, for example, it's estimated that globally for petroleum subsidies, the bottom income quintile gets 7% of the benefits, 93% leak away to higher income groups, including 43% to the top income quintile. So if we want to help low income households, we want much more targeted measures, like targeted adjustments to the broader tax and benefit system, targeted interventions in health, education, housing, job programs, and so on. Now, as part of this study, the IMF conducted about 22 case studies of attempts at energy price reform, and they concluded that there were several key ingredients for a successful reform of energy prices. First of all, it's very important to clarify what your long-term policy objectives are. I mean, if your long-term objective is to completely liberalize energy prices, make that very clear from the start. So obviously, this is all common sense, really, but obviously you want to communicate the size of the subsidies to the general public. That's particularly important in these oil-producing countries where the subsidies are very opaque, because the subsidies aren't direct transfers through the government budget, because you're just holding down oil prices instead. Obviously, you want to communicate the benefits of subsidy reform in terms of how much money households will get back when the revenues are recycled in tax cuts, or how many schools or hospitals will be built. It's important to depoliticize the setting of energy prices, maybe link domestic prices to international prices through some automatic mechanism that's administered by an independent body. And it's obviously important to compensate vulnerable groups like low-income households and trade-sensitive firms, which requires very serious research on the distributional impacts of higher energy prices to get some objective sense of how much compensation might be appropriate for these groups. So finally, what's the role of donor finance or climate finance in all of this? Well, the conventional IMF view, I think, would be that there is a role for donor funding in financing the fixed costs of about 1 more minute, if that's okay. There is a role for donor funding to help pay for the fixed costs of policy reform, setting up databases, computer systems, conducting pilot programs for establishing social safety net programs or expanding them. But there's not really a role for donor finance for ongoing spending, like ongoing transfer payments to low-income households. That really needs to be self-sustaining from domestic revenue sources. But maybe, I mean, speaking personally, not the IMF, it seems to be that there might be an important role for using climate finance as a reward for good practice. I mean, in particular, if a country could set up a really well-designed carbon pricing scheme and be a model for other countries, I mean, there's just huge spillover benefits for that, because it provides a model for other countries to follow. It provides a model for international organizations to point to and say, that's what you all should be doing. And whenever there's big spillover benefits, in principle, that justifies heavy subsidies. But I think the first priority is to develop internationally acceptable metrics for comparing countries' performance on climate mitigation. I mean, for example, you might have a tax on carbon emissions, but maybe you're undermining that tax to some extent through altering broader fiscal provisions affecting the energy system. So I think the OECD's made a useful first start here. They've developed measures of the effective taxes on CO2 in different countries, taking into account broader tax provisions in the energy system. But I think a lot more work needs to be done on developing these acceptable metrics for comparing countries' performance. And then perhaps based on these metrics, it might be plausible to come up with some award schemes for the best developing countries in terms of these metrics. Okay.
Well, thanks very much for that, Ian. It's stimulating. So, Eli, 2016, you got the presidency, got both houses of Congress, and they've thrown up their hands and say, we trust you. So, sort.
2016, China has a carbon tax.
No, China's still in the pilot stage. And they may not. And one of the questions, of course, is, aside from the scale, what he would spend the money on. You know, given that it's going to be phased in. I guess to determine whether or not he's going to have border tax adjustments, it matters to know whether or not China has an equivalent tax. But assume that they don't.
Okay. Thinking politically, and not in terms of what I would say would be the ideal policies. Examine a Republican administration and want President Cruz, say, to get reelected. Fundamentally, I don't favor President Cruz myself, by the way, I should mention. But let's say that I'm looking for the reelection of President Cruz. I would look at trying to find a tax that could be eliminated altogether at a reasonable price for a carbon tax in the $15 to $20 a ton range, which is where I'd set it, probably about 18. The tax that could most easily be eliminated altogether and that would have the best effects is the employee portion of the Medicare payroll tax. That the math for that works out very elegantly, so that would do it. I would set up a carbon tax probably at $18 a ton although I'd probably calibrate it to eliminate the Medicare payroll tax. And the price there will be between 15 and 20, depending on exactly where you put it. I would also have it rise steadily at a predictable rate over time, probably with some cap, but a cap at least twice its starting level, increasing $1 or $2 a year. Until it reaches the higher level. Once the Medicare payroll tax was eliminated, I would probably use the remaining revenue brought in, first for Medicare, since you expect this tax to have declining revenue after a time. First, to just continue Medicare, and second, to reduce the corporate income tax rates. There's a very interesting Harvard University of Michigan study that shows that corporate income taxes are in fact paid 80% by employees, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Customers can switch products, stockholders can sell the stock. Employees, particularly lower skilled ones, have a very hard time changing jobs. So they're the ones who pay the most. I would look towards using it in the context of broad corporate tax reform. We currently have the highest or second highest statutory marginal corporate tax rate in the OECD. And that's clearly a major drag on competitiveness. So reform it to a flatter, lower rate, working towards eliminating it, which you probably need more than simply carbon taxes to do that. I think would be quite desirable to have no tax on corporate income whatsoever. If I were to get into what I think would be maybe the best policy, and what I would really do first, without thinking about President Cruz getting reelected, I would actually eliminate all tariffs, which is easy to do with a small carbon tax, is probably the best global development policy we could have, would be to have no tariffs on our own economy. And would be good for consumers, good for just about anybody but the people paying the concentrated cost who would show up with pitchforks at the White House. So.
Okay, on China, I think the schedule is about the emissions trading scheme. So the government current plan is that, so they do piloting now, and between 2016 to 2020, so basically 13th five-year plan, and they would like to launch nationwide emissions trading scheme. But that of course depends on the ongoing debate on tax versus emissions trading scheme. And then you ask a question that how to spend the money collect. If they go to emissions trading scheme, and currently, probably before 2020, unlikely they would do auction, which means there would no real revenue generated from this emissions trading scheme. That's why Ministry of Finance always prefer tax. That's where part of increase their tax, increase their overall revenue. But I just give you example that they have, of course, all those energy efficiency funds, and that's where the Ministry of Finance has used a significant portion of funding to promote energy efficiency. And they do have a fund, public financing, to reward good performers, those enterprises. Yeah. But in terms of emissions trading scheme, by 2020, I don't think auction would really take place. It would take time. Probably post 2020, if everything works well, they may go for auction and they would collect some revenue.
Yeah. Ian, may I ask you about the question of the definitions of subsidy? Is there was the G20 who originally asked for the study from you and some sister organizations. Were they? I presume that some of the G20 countries weren't all that happy with the report. Is there a consensus on the definition of what a subsidy is amongst the G20 countries? And then while you think about that, my second question would be, there hasn't seemed to be, any announcements of acceptance of all the recommendations in the report. It's very slow. What's your prognosis for action on it?
two rather difficult questions, actually. I mean, obviously, the what we call the pre-tax subsidies, the gap between domestic prices and international prices, is generally accepted, I think. But I think the major contribution of the report was to draw attention to the implicit subsidies due to the failure to charge for environmental damages. I mean, to me, that's all part of the costs of producing fuels. There's the regular manufacturing costs, and then there's the costs on the environment. And, it's a no-brainer to me that both should be reflected in fuel prices. So I think a major contribution of the report was to draw attention to just how large these implicit subsidies are, and that we shouldn't be just focusing on the pure fiscal subsidies. We should be also focusing on the implicit subsidies, because they're much larger, and they require action not just amongst developing countries, but in particular developed countries. United States, for example, is one of the main contributors to these broader definition of subsidies due to the failure to charge for environmental damages. So I think drawing attention to that this is a pervasive problem across pretty much all countries. They all need to fairly dramatic reforms of their energy prices, aligning them better with environmental damages, and targeting the environmental damages a lot better than we do at present. So this is sort of like a message for all countries. They might not be happy with it, but I think that was hopefully would change in the terms of the debate by drawing attention to the need for pricing environmental damages as well. And then on prognosis, well, I mean, it's difficult for us to predict how this will all turn out. We're just focused on trying to have objective analyses of where ideally countries should be headed in terms of pricing environmental damages and fuels. We're going to release a report early in next year which provides a very detailed assessment of environmental damages by different types of fossil fuel products, and for as many countries as we can, in fact about 140 countries. So, our main message, which our managing director reinforced yesterday, was that, we think front and center in environmental policy or green growth has to be getting energy prices right. But up to recently, there hasn't been much practical guidance for actually implementing that principle. But hopefully with this new report, where we provide specific estimates of what countries should be doing based on what we think are plausible estimates of the pollution damages, carbon damages, and then the additional motor vehicle externalities, we're providing specific actionable guidance on where we think countries should be heading in terms of taxing fuels. And that, I think that's very useful. I mean, it may be a long time before countries, they're not going to implement these tax reforms overnight, but it provides a benchmark against which other policies can be evaluated to illustrate the trade-offs for policymakers. So if they're pursuing some regulatory alternative or some other fiscal measure that's not well targeted, we can then say, well, you're only achieving, say, 1/10 of the emissions reductions you would achieve with the ideal policy. So having this benchmark against which to evaluate other policy options, helps to illuminate the trade-offs, and hopefully over the longer term leads to more informed policy decisions.
Before I open to the questions from the floor, I wonder if any of the panelists have a question of their fellow panelists. In 2016, are you going to keep the IMF in business if they're pointing out this kind of stuff, or are we going to close them down?
Our street has been active in putting together the Green Scissors report along with our partners at Taxpayers for Common Sense and Friends of the Earth. I can't speak to the particular numbers, but we're against all energy subsidies of all sorts. It's a pretty simple policy. We work with Americans for Prosperity to eliminate wind power subsidies, and Friends of the Earth to eliminate coal and oil subsidies. So we see a zero subsidy policy. That is what our entire staff agrees on. There should be no energy subsidies whatsoever. So as long as you're leveling it, and I want to get rid of them in any order I can. So I have no problem. I haven't reviewed those numbers, but certainly the idea of them doesn't strike me as at all problematic. I think that's exactly the way we should go. And that's the way that every energy expert says we should go. It's just that everybody says, oh yeah, I want to eliminate the subsidies I don't like tomorrow, yesterday, and then maybe 20 years from now, when we get every other policy I want, then we'll eliminate the subsidies for the stuff that I like. That's what every energy expert left and right basically says. And that's a way to ensure that you get nowhere. So eliminating energy subsidies is a good idea, and do it in whatever order you can. It'll eventually work out better than having all of these subsidies that work at cross purposes.
Any comment? If not, you can open up. In the back. Oh, that's you in the shirt.
Our question had to be, we had a government in Australia collapse.
Oh, sorry. We had a government in Australia like a month ago, just basically collapsed in large part because of the slogan of the opposition was "Stop the carbon tax." So the question was just how do you make this more politically acceptable? How do you? I mean, we have people like you might in some circles in the conservative camps who might support us. But broadly speaking, how does this become, politically acceptable? Is there a strategy for this? And just to speak on the trend going forward, is this becoming less politically acceptable now, or are you seeing progress in the front? Is this becoming more mainstream? Or?
Sure. I've actually... Okay.
Government in Australia that is nominally liberal. But my question to add to that same question is actually what would it take for those with not just power but money, so politicians and investors, sometimes they're overlapping, to lose confidence in the profitability of fossil fuels? Related to that, I guess the comment that I wanted to tag to that question was just to say that the studies on subsidies and all of the great reasons why it's good not to have them, I totally agree with, but they're all carrots, not sticks. They're not going to make you lose confidence in fossil fuels themselves. They're just going to give you more academic reasons, if you like, not political reasons, to actually address that reform. And while I agree with almost everything that you're saying, Ilaila, the one place where I disagree is that if it was enough to wait for us to be wealthy, then you would have thought 20 years, which was enough for the World Bank, might also be enough for society since we started talking about climate change in 1992. So when does the future start for us to be wealthy enough to actually start to use some of that money?
Okay, well, there are any number of questions here, so let me try to untangle probably 5 or 6 questions. First,
Margaret Thatcher always used to say, that's the wrong question. The correct question is, then she would answer it. So feel free.
So, first, on the question of Australia, I personally would have voted Liberal National myself. Were I Australian, and have no love for the scheme that was referred to by the Liberal Nationals and by much of the media as a carbon tax. The official name was the ETS, Emissions Trading Scheme, which reveals what it was, which was a cap-and-trade system. Cap-and-trade is, in my judgment, entirely unworkable in any form that doesn't eliminate the cap entirely and have a predictable price set by auction for carbon, which is a carbon tax. So I don't think that carbon tax is practically workable in any democracy or any authoritarian state. There's too much client politics in democracies and too much corruption in authoritarian states for cap and trade to ever work, and ditching the scheme was quite a good idea in Australia, and something that I personally would have supported. The problem is that it was the wrong kind of thing. It involved a cap and trade scheme where the government kept much of the revenue. That's not at all the type of policy I'm talking about. The type of policy I'm talking about is one that actually frees the economy and reduces regulation. That was nothing that the Labour government was doing in Australia. So that's the Australia question. On profitability of fossil fuels, how could I put this? I don't actually care that much, personally, about making fossil fuels unprofitable. The reason why the U.S. is going to hit Waxman-Markey's targets and probably exceed them by 2020 is because of fossil fuels, is because of a switch to natural gas, which is a fantastic thing. It's true that in the very long term, we should try to transition away from fossil fuels, and in fact we must and we will. But it's not a good short-term goal. In fact, it's probably an economically destructive one to say nothing tomorrow. Natural gas in particular has a very large ongoing role. It won't get us all the way there, but neither will any other existing technology. So a technology that gets us part of the way there is good. It's not desirable to remove the profits implicit at all fossil fuels. In the shorter term, there probably should be some emphasis on phasing out the use of coal. But to a large extent, we're doing that already. And it seems likely to happen by itself. If there were something that suddenly made it enormously attractive to start using coal, you'd have to look at it. But the nature of coal pollution, the biggest problem really is probably not CO2, but particulates. And for that reason alone, it's undesirable to build new coal plants. And I see that as the one fuel that's a real short-term problem. And that we'd look at, but it isn't an existing problem, and I don't see it becoming one anytime in the near future.
Just like to respond to your comments on cap and trade. Just on cap and trade. I think the cap and trade is very much inspired by SO2 trading here in the U.S. and proved very efficient and cheap objective. So I'm just struck by your comments that the cap and trade totally unworkable.
Sure. The SO2 trading scheme was very good for that pollutant. It was emitted by about 70 point sources, which were the entire problem, which could be counted and were in fact named by name in the legislation and regulations. Furthermore, the pollutant those point sources alone caused a significant danger to human health and to the natural environment in the area where they were. None of those things are so for CO2. The number of point sources is virtually unlimited. The contribution of any given point source is trivial, and the emissions from any given point source are not by themselves a danger to human health. The amount of CO2 within reasonable numbers in the atmosphere isn't going to make it hard for people to breathe or by itself cause deaths. So SO2 is a very different pollutant. And therefore, it was a practicable way to say these 70 things will cap and trade. That was workable for that, just as the Clean Air Act was generally a good way to deal with particulate pollution. Whether or not the Supreme Court was right to uphold the endangerment, to require the endangerment finding, essentially, with regard to CO2 is a different matter altogether. But what's clear is that this isn't what the CAA was written for, was dealing with CO2. CO2 is a different kind of pollutant, and it is a pollutant, but it needs to be dealt with in a different way. Using the Clean Air Act or cap and trade to deal with it is like using a jackhammer to fix a wristwatch. So I just don't see it being a workable solution in practice, given the nature of the problem. It was a good idea for CO2, but unless you have an authoritarian system that's not at all corrupt, it's not going to work.
Lawrence. And then, Lawrence, when you're done, pass the mic back there.
Sorry, can I just say one thing?
Sorry.
Or shall I? Oh, well, just on in response to the Australian carbon pricing scheme, and we thought that was a pretty good system in terms of being pretty comprehensive, establishing a pretty robust price, over $20 per ton of CO2, and also auctioning most of the allowances and then using most of the revenue to cut other taxes to triple the personal income tax threshold. And we hoped that by tripling the personal income tax threshold, that would help lock in the policy, because to reverse the policy, you then need to come up with new revenue sources to plug that gap that you've created. So it kind of remains to be seen what will happen if they scrap the scheme. They'll lose all the revenues, so now they'll have to somehow come up with some other new tax increase or spending cut to pay for the tripling of the personal income tax threshold, which isn't going to go away. So it kind of remains to be seen how that's all going to work out. I think a major problem, a lot of opposition to the pricing scheme in Australia was because of concerns about competitiveness, because Australia was pricing CO2 at what we think is a reasonable level, but was much higher than what other countries were doing. In the EU ETS, the prices were maybe 25% of those in Australia. So if the EU had a more robust price, as is said, by maybe having a price floor, which locks in the minimum price of, say, $20, $30 per ton, then those concerns about competitiveness in Australia may have been less of an issue. So if we can build a coalition of countries that are imposing a robust price on carbon emissions, perhaps by the major 15 or 20 or so emitting countries, ideally working towards agreeing on a minimum price for CO2, as more countries establish this price, the concerns about competitiveness decline. Because I don't really think there's a good way, if one country acts unilaterally, I don't think that there are good instruments for adequately dealing with the competitiveness issue. I mean, there's border tax adjustments or subsidies for firms in trade-exposed sectors, but none of them is a particularly good instrument for fully addressing the compensation issue. Unlike for low-income households, we have a lot of instruments at our disposal: tax instruments, benefit instruments, targeted spending, public spending, to help establish safety nets to cushion the effects on low-income households. But so the competitiveness seems to be a major stumbling block.
Ellie, I don't want to go after you, but I guess you get used to it, because probably enjoy that different views and or people who disagree with you. Just quickly, I'm struck by your comments on how you describe cap and trade, and it seems to me that if you just follow your logics, then you would say cap and trade would only apply to countries authoritarian and did I understand you correctly? It's different. You say basically you say that it's CO2 is a different pollutant, and also a democratic country may not be suitable for. Did I understand you correctly?
I think that any democratic country, client groups, as we saw with Waxman Markey, as we've seen in the EU, as we saw in Australia, various groups that have an in with the politicians will use any cap and trade scheme to get stuff for themselves, and it will be very hard to apply it with any degree of evenness. In an authoritarian state, first, if the government is reasonably responsive, they'll respond to the same types of client groups, and if they aren't, they'll just use it to give gifts to their friends. Either way, you lose. So it doesn't work in democracy, and it doesn't work in authoritarian states.
I just want to use so we have California, we have South Korea, we have New Zealand. They all apply. They're all using cap and trade. How you explain this theory?
Well, I don't think any of them are going to work. I mean, that's my I'm not deeply familiar with, say, the New Zealand scheme, but the California and South Korean schemes are dominated by client politics and seem unlikely to work, and are in any case much more burdensome than a carbon tax would be, and require much more administrative overhead, many more costs. Even if they do work, a carbon tax would work better, and I believe that the nature of democratic governance makes it almost impossible for a cap and trade scheme to work, because you're creating these carbon credits out of thin air by government fiat, and there is an enormous temptation, quite understandable, for politicians who want votes to create more of them, give them away, do all sorts of messed up things with them. And that seems to be almost impossible to overcome in any reasonable system. And if you look for the design parameters that might let you overcome it, you can say, okay, we're going to auction off all of them, we'll have predictable prices, we won't give any away. Well, then you have a system that's just like a carbon tax, so why not have a carbon tax?
Well, speaking of the distinction between authoritarian and democratic, I want to make clear this is, speaking of the distinction between authoritarian and democratic, this is not a democratic institution. This is an authoritarian institution. We have about 6 more minutes for questions, so I'm just going to take the 3 that are, I've got 4, very quick, and you're not entitled to 2 questions. You're entitled to 1 question each. Please, Lawrence.
I want to commend Ian and the IMF for their work on subsidies, and I think your final point about coming up with some measures of what those subsidies are can be consistent across countries is a great idea. My question has to do with the extent to which you can comment and which the IMF might eventually get involved in thinking about the politics of this. With structural adjustment, you said, we don't do politics, you've got to balance your budget. Over time, that changed, and I think the IMF came to recognize that you needed to engage and think through what was politically sustainable. These things are really hard to do. Getting energy prices right is going to be politically incredibly difficult in every country for different reasons. And I wonder whether that's an area that the IMF is going to be able to help client countries with.
Let's take all the questions.
Just one brief comment on the PMR and this initiative. I just have to share with other participants here that this is a trust fund that's not really known out there, but it's really a forum where you see a true exchange of knowledge and experience between developed and developing countries, and I've never seen there any moment where we had to really enter into political things. So there are really opportunities for the U.S. to learn from Australia and learning from China. It's really interesting. But my question to Schumann is, many of the countries that participate in the PMR, they don't have yet a clear political decision on implementing a carbon tax or carbon markets. So how do you see that the work at the PMR, what kind of benefits these countries will have, although they don't have any expectation or in terms of implementing these instruments in the future?
Okay, let's just collect the last 2 questions, please.
Yeah, Lad Canal Conservation International. My question would be on the setting the social cost of carbon and what discount rate you would use and the kind of range of damages that you would take, how you would base that. I'd also be very interested to hear about the politics of selling a revenue-neutral carbon tax in the U.S. Congress, but maybe that's another discussion.
Patel from WRI and amongst others. I'm a little bit intrigued because I think everybody's recognized that a carbon tax was the most efficient way to go about things, and I don't think anybody has said that that is not the first best. But all these other things like cap and trade and whatever you call it, I thought evolved because the political possibility of instituting a carbon tax was seen to be so darn difficult, and cap and trade had certain precedents, particularly in this country, on the SOX and so on, that I thought that it was being pursued more because it seemed to be an easier thing or an achievable thing to do compared to a carbon tax. So I'm now a little bit intrigued at this discussion, which is sort of knocking cap and trade. I don't think anybody came out saying cap and trade is the way to go. I think most people recognize that the most efficient way to do this is to tax carbon, but we were in a way forced to pursue other options because the tax seems so difficult to achieve. But I'm just confused.
My instructions were to wrap up with a request from each of the panelists, giving them 2 minutes, but given the questions, I'm going to give you 3 minutes each. Can we start with you, Ian?
Oh, okay. Yeah, in terms of trying to move forward energy pricing reforms, I mean, yeah, we have our TA work and we have our analytical agenda, which were intertwined. One feeds on the other. But so in our analytical agenda, we can do research on clarifying the distributional incidence of energy price reforms to provide objective evidence on who's losing under these reforms and by how much, and what would be the most efficient policy instruments to mitigate those adverse burdens on vulnerable groups. So that's research that we can do using input-output tables and consumer expenditure survey and so on. We can also look at the trade-offs between different policy choices, evaluate regulatory alternatives versus taxes in terms of their effectiveness at reducing emissions, what the revenue advantage of taxes is, and so on. And we can emphasize in our TA work that promoting the right amount of green growth to us is a large extent just straightforward principles of basic tax policy. We widely implement fuel taxes now. They're widely accepted. They're fairly easy to administer, and to us it's a matter of extending those to other fossil fuel products, setting them at the right levels based on objective evidence about environmental damages. But this isn't rocket science. This is very basic and fairly straightforward tax policy to get the prices right. So that's another thing we can emphasize in our TA, and then hopefully these messages will get across and we'll start to see reforms in the right direction, and then as we do so, we can hold up countries as examples for other countries to follow, and hopefully these effects will begin to have a bandwagon effect over time.
Yeah, just quickly, thank you, Atu, and it's good to see you here. So in fact, the majority of PMR are on the recipient side, it's somehow so-called, or using the popular term, undecided, in the sense they have not really made decision on which way to go. So what to be done, in between. So one part of the work is analytical work, including modeling work, to provide analytical studies and policy studies. This is a policy foundation for policymakers, when they at the point of making decision. The second is that whole technical readiness building. When we talk about a carbon tax or cap and trade, most developing countries do not even have GHG data. So how you help countries collect data and build up this MRV framework is a huge task and takes time. So in between, that can be done, so-called no-regret measures. And let me just also quickly address about the carbon tax and cap and trade. I think the fundamental issue is to price carbon. Whether which scheme would be most suitable, it's a political process, it's an economic analysis. Eventually, countries make a decision based on a number of factors. Yeah.
Thanks so much for all of the interesting comments and intriguing questions that people posed. I'll use my closing to talk just a little bit about the reasons why I think that a carbon tax is indeed a politically practicable and practical way to move forward. Fundamentally, getting the revenues that are necessary to carry out the vital functions of government, whatever those are decided to be, is one of the greatest challenges facing any liberal democracy. The current fiscal situation makes it very hard to envision a way that taxes overall could be cut in any significant way without very serious reform in the entitlements programs in the United States, and this applies to almost all other developed countries as well, that there is virtually no way to cut taxes without seriously reforming entitlements. Given that serious entitlement reform, for a variety of reasons, is politically incredibly difficult, creating a more efficient tax system is the single best way you can reduce the drag on the economy imposed by both taxes and regulations. So since we can't simply reduce revenues, we need to look for other things. Pigouvian taxes in general are the best tool we have and the least utilized tool we have. It isn't that they're the best. No tax is really good. The power to tax is the power to destroy. But nonetheless, Pigouvian taxes are better than all of the other alternatives. As such, they demand consideration as countries look to reduce taxes and regulation. And in fact, the ability to price things more accurately, the data revolutions we've had, make them more practicable than they were in the past. This doesn't mean that they're easy, but it does mean that it's the only viable path towards tax reform. Now, do I really favor a carbon tax as such? Actually, I don't. If somebody could show me tomorrow that you could raise the same amount of money through a tax on sewage or Britney Spears or Miley Cyrus or whatever, anything else that's bad, I'd jump on that tax immediately. There's no magic to taxing carbon, but it is an awfully convenient thing. It's a way essentially of taxing energy. There are a few big pots you can tax, and carbon is probably the best way to do it that I know of right now. But a shift towards Pigovian taxes is, I think, almost inevitable over the next 20 to 30 years throughout the entire developed world. And carbon seems like the most logical of them. It isn't the only one, but it's the bandwagon that I'm on right now. I'll switch bandwagons if something comes up. Don't get me wrong.
Well, thanks very much. Just one optimistic note is the province of British Columbia, where I reside, established a carbon tax. It was very ingeniously designed. It was revenue neutral. It actually sent out checks to low-income people, tax tested rebates before the system was implemented, so that people would see that it's fair. Notwithstanding that, the opposition party ran on the last election on the basis of closing down the carbon tax, and fortunately, the opposition lost. So reason has prevailed in at least in one jurisdiction in terms of a tax. On your behalf, let me thank our panel, three real experts. I think it was an excellent discussion, and I'm to announce a 5-minute break.